The sound of screeching brakes echoed through the subway station, but Daniel barely noticed. His fingers trembled as he opened the violin case to reveal an aged instrument. Its wood cracked in a few places, but still holding the echoes of a once glorious past. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to bring it here, to this noisy, indifferent place full of rushing strangers. Maybe it was the faded photograph he had found in an old shoebox the night before. Him as a child, holding this very violin, beaming on a stage as his parents clapped in the audience. Or maybe it was the voice of loneliness that had finally screamed too loud to ignore. Slowly, Daniel raised the violin to his chin. The first note was raw, unpolished, and wavered through the humid air like a beginner's hesitant words. People barely glanced his way. A businessman hurried past without looking. A mother grabbed her child's hand and moved toward the next train. But Daniel closed his eyes and played through the cacophony of indifference. Each note grew steadier, clearer, and soon he wasn't just playing, he was remembering. The years of rigorous training as a child, the small competitions that led to big stages, and the night he had stood in a grand concert hall, a star in the making. Then the images darkened. The accident, the loss, the unbearable silence that followed. As he played, emotions poured into his music. Grief, longing, guilt, and above all, hope. Slowly, the commuters began to notice. A young girl stopped in her tracks, eyes wide with wonder. An elderly man, leaning on a cane, shook his head as if recalling a long-buried memory. By the time Daniel transitioned into a hauntingly beautiful melody, a small crowd had gathered. Coins and bills began to land in the open violin case, but Daniel wasn't playing for money. He was playing for his soul. When he finally stopped, applause erupted. Daniel lowered the violin slowly, staring at the faces around him. Strangers smiled, some with tears in their eyes. A woman in the front spoke first. "That was breathtaking. What's your name?" "Daniel," he replied, voice quiet but steady for the first time since he could remember. The crowd began to disperse as the train pulled in, but one man lingered. A wiry, older gentleman who introduced himself as Victor, a retired music professor. "You have something extraordinary, Daniel. Have you considered performing again?" The question hit Daniel like a jolt. Perform again? The very idea filled him with equal parts fear and exhilaration. But before he could answer, Victor handed him a card. "Call me. I teach a small program for people like you, people who've walked away from music but were meant to find their way back." That night, staring at Victor's card, Daniel almost didn't make the call. But then he looked at the violin, resting delicately on the couch like a long-lost friend, and the sorrow felt a little less heavy. He dialed the number. For months, Daniel trained under Victor's guidance. It was grueling, not just because of the hours of practice, but because of the internal battles. Every note brought him closer to the old wounds he was afraid to face. The loss of his parents, the guilt of walking away from his passion, the fear of failing again. Yet, with every lesson, every rehearsal, Daniel healed a little more. His confidence returned, not as a blazing fire, but as a steady glow. Finally, the day came for Daniel's first public performance in over 10 years. It wasn't a grand concert hall like before. It was a small community center, filled with children, families, and retirees. Daniel stepped onto the modest stage, clutching his violin and shaking slightly. When the first note rang out, however, all the fear melted away. He played not for the applause, not for validation, but for the joy he was finally allowing back into his heart. The crowd rose to their feet, and for the first time in years, Daniel smiled. A smile that reached deep into his soul. The music had brought him back to life. Daniel's story reminds us of one profound truth. It's never too late to come home to yourself. No matter how broken you feel, no matter how far you think you've fallen, the things that truly matter, the passions, the connections, the love, will always be there, waiting for you to rediscover them. So ask yourself, What's the music in your own life that you've silenced? Perhaps it's time to let it play again. Start today, and the rest will follow.